Research suggests that Indigenous peoples have high infant mortality rates, low education, experience homelessness more than non-Indigenous Australians, have high unemployment rates, and if employed, receive on average low wages. These comparisons show that most Indigenous Australians not only fall below the poverty line but also fall out of the top of the distribution and experience both relative and absolute poverty. Living below the poverty line with the erosion of safety net due to governmental reforms, most Indigenous people are unemployed, live in large households, and are located in remote and economically depressed areas. They also face long-term health problems, shame, incarceration, child removal from natural families, high level of discrimination and racism which act as barrier to education, employment, and housing opportunities. Other factors which have been identified as driving these disadvantages include the broad impact of colonization and society's limited understanding of Indigenous culture and values. Due to lack of employment and their dependency on welfare payment, they are considered by non-Indigenous as being deviant, fakeless, and unwilling to find employment. They are thus individually and culturally defined as being responsible for their poverty. Those who hold these views fail understanding that the poverty Indigenous Australians experience is structural, complex, and much more entrenched than that of many non-Indigenous people. And indeed, poverty is a wicked problem. To be able to understand Indigenous poverty, only history provides the answer. It is only history that provides an understanding of social construct of racism, normalcy, power imbalance, and privileges on one side, and on the other, the lives of many being on the edge, targeted by bans on alcohol, and dependent on welfare payment and emergency relief. It is important to understand these issues because by recognizing that poverty in Indigenous families is shaped by history, practitioners will begin advocating for macro reforms to redress inequalities and break the cycle of poverty. Indeed, structural change, comprehensive community-based strategies, and the incorporation of poverty-aware practices will be key in improving outcomes for children and families in Indigenous communities. This change can only be achieved by taking holistic approaches in ways which take into account the full cultural, socio-economic, and emotional context of their lives, including awareness of the ongoing legacy of trauma, grief, and loss associated with colonization, active involvement of Indigenous communities, collaborative working relationships, adopting a strength-based perspective, and valuing Indigenous knowledge and culture. Accordingly, practitioners need to use the already developed greater effort approaches such as soft entry, no wrong doors, assertive outreach in promoting greater engagement with Indigenous peoples, and in redressing the effect of social exclusion. They are also well positioned to become allies and become motivated in challenging any behaviors or practices which are unjust and against principles of human rights, and start thinking about sharing contents on microaggression, discrimination, and prejudices in their workplaces or families to continue the learning of both themselves and others. This will demand taking anti-approaches in addressing issues affecting Indigenous Australians. As part of my practice framework, I have developed knowledge of Australia's history of racism, cultural diversity, race and whiteness, social justice and human rights, issues of power, cultural diversity, critical self-reflectivity, cultural competence, and professional ethics. This knowledge will help me avoid counterproductive stereotyping and assumptions about Indigenous Australian service users. As part of my coursework, I am still developing fast and ethnic sensitive practice which will restore to people an appreciation of their cultural experience and identity in my future work. And second, a class-sensitive practice from which I understand the social realities of being locked in and being marginalized by oppression. For all of us who are going to work or who are currently working with Indigenous Australians, it is important to work from a strength perspective rather than pathologizing them, and acknowledge that most Indigenous Australians communities are places of resilience, of fellowship, and of good humor. We also need to learn and work from research evidence practice about what works and what does not work for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians so as to avoid tensions in our practices.